Chapter 1. Introduction: The Legacy of the Gladiators. The Gladiators' performance immediately conjures up images of massive amphitheaters, raging crowds, and brave fighters competing against each other in the face of death. Even today, the fascination is unbroken. Whether in films, books, or video games, the image of the gladiators symbolizes courage, discipline, and a certain archaic ideal of strength and honor. But to truly understand the gladiators, you have to go far back in history, to the origins of their fights, the social structures of ancient Rome, and the development of a practice that was far more than mere spectacle. Gladiators were not only slaves, prisoners of war, or convicts, as is often suggested in popular representations. They were also part of a complex social and cultural system that primarily served entertainment, but also demonstrated political power, reflected social values, and embedded religious rituals. Their struggles combined death and staging, brutality and artistry, and their stories are testimonies to human ambitions, fears, and dreams. The fascination for the gladiators also stems from the fact that they stood at the intersection of many facets of Roman life. They were a reflection of social hierarchies, political power games, and religious beliefs. A gladiator could be a slave or a freedman, man or woman, experienced or freshly trained. But regardless of their origins, they were united by a common fate: the arena, a place where life could end at any time and where death was also a form of art. The arena itself was more than just a scene for fights. It was a stage on which political messages were conveyed, social tensions were channeled, and collective emotions were staged. For the spectators, a game was not only entertainment, but also a ritual that manifested the power of the state, conveyed moral messages, and embodied the Roman self-image of strength, honor, and discipline. The gladiators were at once actors and victims, heroes and tools, whose lives and deaths reflected the pulse of an entire civilization. But the legacy of the gladiators goes beyond the bloody arenas. Their stories also tell of human endurance, of the search for fame and honor, of the ability to overcome adversity and assert one's place in a complex world. In many aspects, parallels can be drawn to today's sports, show forms, and even military traditions. The cultural resonance of gladiators endures for thousands of years, showing that they were not just a product of their time, but a symbol deeply rooted in the collective consciousness of humanity. In the coming chapters, we will explore the history of gladiators step by step. From their early origins to training in the ludus schools, the diversity of their classes, the staging of the games, and their influence on politics, religion, and society. We will meet famous gladiators, look at life away from the arena, and trace the slow decline of this culture, which, despite all the brutality, left traces of human creativity, discipline, and organization. The journey through the world of gladiators is also a journey through ancient Rome itself. It reveals the tensions between life and death, freedom and coercion, violence and entertainment. It shows how a society used rituals and games to legitimize power, convey values, and shape identity of humanity. If you want to understand the gladiators, you have to look not only at the arena, but also at the people who created them, the spectators who admired them, and the stories that still tell of their bravery, courage, and tragedy.
Chapter 2. The Origins: Etruscan and Early Roman Battles. Before the gladiators became the famous figures we know from stories, films, and historical accounts, there was a long history of bloody battles on the Italian peninsula. The roots of gladiatorial culture go deep into the time before the Roman Republic, especially to the Etruscans, a people who lived in the area of what is now northern and central Italy and had a great influence on early Roman culture. The Etruscans were masters in many arts, religion, and architecture, and they attached great importance to ritual practices that combined death and the code of honor. Their ritual ceremonies included fights between warriors, which often took place as part of funeral rituals. These battles were less for entertainment than for honoring the dead, and were an expression of a deep-rooted belief in the power of blood and sacrifice. The Etruscans' faith did not see death as an end, but as a transition, and the battles were a form of symbolic support for the soul of the deceased. Rome itself adopted many of these customs from the Etruscans, but it developed them further and gradually transformed them into a public spectacle. The first documented gladiator fights in Rome took place in the 3rd century BC and were part of funeralia, the funeral rituals of wealthy patricians. Legend has it that in 264 BC, 3 gladiators were killed at a funeral in Rome, an event that is considered the official beginning of Roman gladiator culture. These fights initially had only ritual significance. They were an expression of respect for the dead and a symbol of bravery and honor. But over time, the function of these fights changed. They increasingly became a means of public self-presentation and political demonstration of power. Patricians used the gladiatorial games to show their wealth, power, and influence. The originally ritual practice turned into a spectacle that attracted the attention of the population and at the same time underlined the social status of the organizers. In this phase, you also begin to recognize the basics for the gladiator classes that would later become known. Different fighting techniques, equipment, and roles that gave the games more structure and drama. It is interesting to note that the Roman adoption and transformation of gladiator culture was closely linked to the political and social transformation of the city. Rome expanded, became a power in the Mediterranean, and with this expansion, the importance of the games as an instrument of public control and propaganda grew. Gladiator fights were not just for entertainment. They were a means of keeping the people busy, securing loyalty, and dampening potential unrest. The arena thus became a microcosm of Roman society, where power, violence, entertainment, and social hierarchies collided. In addition to the ritual and political significance, the early gladiator fights also had a social dimension. They offered slaves, prisoners of war, and criminals the opportunity to earn a certain status through bravery and skill, even when their lives were at stake. A few gladiators achieved great fame through their skills and courage, and some were even released after proving themselves in the arena. This shows that the origins of gladiatorial culture were closely linked to the social structures of Rome. Power, death, and fame were inseparable. The early phase of the gladiatorial games was thus characterized by a mixture of religion, social order, and ritual seriousness. At first, the battles were not just a pastime, but a reflection of Roman values and beliefs. But the transformation from ritual act to publicly staged spectacle was inevitable, because with Rome's expansion, the population grew and the demand for entertainment increased. Slowly but surely, the system we know today as gladiator culture emerged, a unique combination of brutality, discipline, tactics, and dramatic staging. With this in mind, we better understand why gladiators were so deeply rooted in Roman culture. Their struggles were not only a mirror of the past, but also a precursor to what would later become one of the greatest public spectacles of antiquity, the Roman amphitheater, where thousands of spectators relived the story of life, death, and honor.
Chapter 3. The First Gladiator Show, Funeral Fights. The first gladiator fights in ancient Rome were closely linked to one of the most fundamental rituals of society at the time: death and burial. These early games were not held as mere entertainment, but as part of the so-called funeral fights, which served primarily to honor the dead and accompany the transition of their souls into the afterlife. The practice had its roots in Etruscan traditions, but was adopted by the Romans, adapted, and increasingly institutionally organized. The word gladiator is derived from the Latin gladius, the short sword. The early funeral fights were all about demonstrating bravery, strength, and war skills, qualities that were considered honorable and said to protect the soul of the deceased in the afterlife. At first, these games were mainly fought by volunteer warriors, sometimes also slaves or prisoners of war, who were willing to risk their lives for the honor of the dead. The first documented gladiator show in Rome took place in 264 BC, in which 3 gladiators fought each other in public. They were used as part of a funeral of wealthy patricians. Historians see this as the symbolic beginning of gladiator culture in Rome, a moment in which private mourning and public staging merged. Roman society began to realize that these struggles were not only an act of honor, but also an effective means of demonstrating power, influence, and prestige. Interestingly, the first battles were not necessarily designed for life and death. In the early days, there was a certain consideration. The goal was to show bravery, not necessarily to kill. Over time, however, this changed, and the death of a gladiator increasingly became part of the dramatic staging. The audience, consisting of citizens and later also members of the upper classes, quickly developed a preference for dramatic and brutal performances. The private rituals of the funeral became a public spectacle that conveyed both moral and social messages. The early organization of these games also laid the foundation for the later training and structure of the gladiators. Even in this phase, different fighting styles were tested. Fighters wielded swords, spears, or other weapons, and an understanding of tactics, strategy, and staging developed. Spectators learned to distinguish certain types of fighters, who would later become known as Murmillo, Retiarius, or Thrax. The basis for the complex system of gladiator categories had already been laid. In addition, the funeral fights were a social event. They combined mourning for the dead with the pleasure of the living. The games allowed the patricians to demonstrate their social position while maintaining and controlling the population. The increasing popularity of the games meant that they soon no longer only took place at private funerals, but were also organized as public events. The earliest public arenas and venues were created precisely out of this need, to offer a controlled spectacle to the growing crowds. Another important aspect of these early games was the connection between religion and violence. It was believed that the blood of the gladiators not only had symbolic power, but could also appease the gods. The battles were thus not only a test of human strength, but also a ritual act that seemed to ensure the balance between life and death, between man and God. This religious dimension remained a central component throughout the history of gladiators, even as the games increasingly became a pure spectacle. The evolution from funeral fights to organized public games marks a crucial turning point. Private ritual acts gave rise to a complex social phenomenon that went far beyond its original function. The gladiator fights became an instrument of social control, political propaganda, and the cultural identity of Rome. They combined religion, entertainment, and power in a way that was unique in the history of antiquity. The first gladiator shows thus clearly show how closely violence and ritual, death and entertainment were interwoven in Roman culture. They laid the foundation for what would later become one of the most famous phenomena of the ancient world. The fully developed gladiator culture with permanent schools, professional fighters, and huge amphitheaters. These early games were the seed from which the arena of Rome and the legendary battles of the Colosseum and Circus Maximus grew, a phenomenon that not only fascinated the Romans, but still fires the imagination of people worldwide today.
Chapter 4. Development in the Roman Empire. With the consolidation of Rome as a center of power in the Mediterranean, the gladiatorial games underwent a decisive transformation. The private funeral struggles of the early republic increasingly turned into organized public events that were deeply embedded in the social, political, and cultural structures of the city. This development was closely linked to the rise of Rome, the expansion of its territory, and the growing complexity of its society. In the early republic, gladiator fights were still mainly used to honor the religious of the deceased and to demonstrate bravery. But with the increasing political influence of the patricians and later also of the consuls, the games turned into an instrument of demonstration of power. Wealthy politicians realized that with such events, they could not only gain prestige, but also secure the loyalty of the people. Those who organized the biggest and most spectacular games could increase reputation, popularity, and political power at the same time. The games were increasingly professionally organized. Instead of ad hoc fights at funerals, fixed structures were created. Special arenas were built, rules were developed, and gladiators were trained as professional fighters. Ludus schools were formed, in which slaves, prisoners of war, and volunteer fighters were trained. These schools were not only training centers, but also centers of social discipline and hierarchy. A gladiator underwent systematic training, learned various weapon techniques and strategies, and was prepared for life in the arena. The Roman Empire thus created the first professional athletes in history, whose skills were shaped by discipline, routine, and physical exercise. With professionalization came specializations. Gladiators were divided into different classes, each of which used certain weapons, armor, and fighting techniques. This is how the system of murmillo, thrax, retiarius, or secutor was born, which gave the games a dramatic variety. Each class had its own strengths and weaknesses, and the battles were increasingly strategically staged to maximize excitement and entertainment. The audience learned to recognize the different types and developed preferences that determined the reputation and career of the fighters. The arena itself developed into a central place of urban life. Large amphitheaters were built to accommodate thousands of spectators, and the games became an integral part of the Roman calendar. Imperial corporations, magistrates, and wealthy patricians often organized the events as a political instrument. They used the games to keep the people busy, create loyalty, or distract from social tensions. Violence, death, and spectacle combined in a unique form of public entertainment that simultaneously demonstrated power and stabilized social norms. Another important aspect of the development in the Roman Empire was the increasing inclusion of war experience and military prowess in the games. Many gladiators were former soldiers, prisoners of war, or people who mastered military techniques. The fights thus became not only a form of entertainment, but also a demonstration of discipline, strategic thinking, and physical strength. This gave the games a certain seriousness and increased their cultural value in society. At the same time, the gladiatorial games reflected the social hierarchies of Rome. Slaves, prisoners of war, and convicted criminals fought at the top of the entertainment pyramid, while patricians and citizens took on the role of spectators. Some gladiators gained fame and prestige, a few even their freedom, but most remained tools of a system that shaped life and death according to the ideas of those in power. The arena thus became a microcosm of Roman society. Power, violence, entertainment, and social order merged into a complex network that reflected Rome's values and priorities in a unique way. Over time, gladiator games also gained importance beyond Rome. Provinces, colonies, and friendly cities adopted the practice and adapted it to their own needs. Thus, gladiator culture became a unifying element of the entire Roman Empire, which culturally shaped not only the capital, but large parts of the Mediterranean region. The development of gladiators in the Roman Empire thus clearly shows how an originally ritual act became a comprehensive social phenomenon. The games combined entertainment, religion, political power, and social control, creating a culture whose influences reverberate in sports, theater, and popular culture to this day. They established the gladiators as central figures in Roman life, heroes, actors, and victims at the same time, and laid the foundations for the glamorous games that later took place in the Colosseum and other amphitheaters in Europe and North Africa.
Chapter 5. Gladiator Classes, from Murmillo to Retiarius. The gladiators were not a homogeneous mass of fighters. It was recognized early on that the excitement, entertainment, and dramaturgy of the games depended heavily on the diversity of the fighters. Out of this necessity, the first gladiator classes emerged, which differed in weapons, armor, and fighting technique, and offered the spectators clear role models.
Each class had its own strengths, weaknesses, and distinctive features, a system that allowed for both tactical depth and visual spectacle. Murmillo, the heavily armed man. The Murmillo was the archetypal swordsman. He carried a large rectangular shield, the scutum, and a short sword, the eponymous gladius. His armor usually consisted of a wide-brimmed helmet and sometimes additional leg armor. The Murmillo was heavily armored, which made it relatively slow but very resistant. His fighting style was based on defensive maneuvers, skillful positional play, and powerful direct attacks. The Murmillo often faced lighter, more agile opponents such as the Retiarius, creating exciting contrasts between power and speed. Retiarius, the net launcher. The Retiarius was the exact opposite of the Murmillo, lightly armored, agile, and fast. His main weapons were net, rete, trident, and dagger. The Retiarius used his agility to disarm the enemy or bring him down. His fighting style required skill, tactics, and precise timing. The encounter between Murmillo and Retiarius was particularly popular because it symbolized the classic battle between heavy defense and agile offense. This dynamic created drama and tension, exactly what thrilled the audience. Thrax, the Thracian warrior. The Thrax, named after the Thracian warrior culture, carried a small, rectangular shield and a curved short sword, the Sika. His armor was lighter than that of the Murmillo, but still offered protection for the head, chest, and forearms. The Thrax combined agility with precise slashes to hit the enemy's weak spots. He often fought against the Murmillo or the Hoplomachus, and the different types of weapons led to varied and tactically interesting duels. Secutor, the pursuer. The Secutor was specially trained to hunt the Retiarius. He wore heavier armor, similar to the Murmillo, but his helmet was smooth, without a brim, so as not to fall victim to the net of the Retiarius. The Secutor embodied the principle of relentless hunting, robust, persistent, and uncompromising. The contrast between Secutor and Retiarius was not only tactically, but also visually particularly impressive for the audience. Hoplomachus, the infantry fighter. Hoplomachus was based on Greek hoplites. He carried a small, round shield, a spear, and often a sword as a secondary weapon. His task was to be variable both defensively and offensively. The Hoplomachus was less specialized than other classes, but its versatility offered exciting possibilities for combat staging. Other classes and variants. In addition to these main types, there were numerous variations and special forms, depending on the era, place, or preference of the organizers. Gladiators could be customized, for example with different helmets, shields, or weapon combinations. This diversity was not only a means of entertainment, but also an expression of the creativity of the organizers. The more unusual the fight, the greater the enthusiasm of the spectators. The psychology of gladiator fights. The division of classes also had a psychological effect on the audience. Each gladiator embodied certain virtues: courage, skill, endurance, or brute strength. By combining different types, dramatic narratives were created that created tension, aroused emotions, and involved the audience in the fights. The spectators cheered along, voted for their favorites, and the fate of the gladiators became a shared experience of fear, admiration, and enthusiasm. The differentiation of the gladiators was thus a key element for the success of the games. It made the fights not only spectacular, but also plannable, strategically interesting, and narratively gripping. Each class had its own aesthetics, its own strengths and weaknesses, and the audience learned to appreciate these differences. In combination with the increasing professionalism of the schools and the increasing ritual character of the games, a culture emerged that fascinated for centuries and made the gladiators the icons of ancient Rome. Chapter 6. Training and Everyday Life of Gladiators. The life of a gladiator was characterized by discipline, physical toughness, and a rhythm determined by the arena and the expectations of the spectators. Those who were accepted into a ludus school entered a world in which every day was structured and every movement served a higher purpose. survival in the arena, and maximizing entertainment value for Roman spectators. Training began early in the morning, usually before the city woke up, and began with a rigorous warm-up program that included running, stretches, and simple combat drills. It was not only about strengthening the muscles, but also getting the body used to the stresses of extreme physical exertion. After the warm-up, the training with weapons followed. Every gladiator learned how to use swords, spears, nets, or other typical weapons of his class. The teachers, often experienced former gladiators, paid close attention to posture, technique, and precision. Mistakes were not only seen as weakness, but could be fatal in the arena, which is why the training was characterized by strict discipline. At the same time, tactical thinking was taught. The gladiators learned to anticipate attacks, to read the movements of the opponent, and to use their own strength skillfully. Every move was a building block for the later fights, and every hour of training brought the fighter closer to the perfection that could be the difference between life and death in the arena. In addition to physical training, nutrition was also part of a strictly regulated everyday life. Gladiators were given a high-protein diet, often based on legumes, grains, and occasionally meat. The goal was to maintain muscle mass and increase physical performance. At the same time, the diet was designed for endurance because a fight could last a long time, and the gladiators had to be able to act even under extreme stress and exhaustion. The physical training was supplemented by psychological preparation. Gladiators had to learn to control fear, focus on the opponent, and control their own instincts. Mental strength was just as crucial as physical strength. Many fighters developed close bonds with their training mates, who were often not only colleagues, but also friends and allies in a dangerous world. The school became a microcosm in which loyalty, rivalry, and camaraderie were intertwined. Away from training, everyday life was strictly regulated. Gladiators lived under constant surveillance, had fixed sleeping and rest times, and any violation of the rules could result in punishment. At the same time, there were rare moments of freedom, when they could rest, socialize, or share stories of struggles. These moments were important for processing the psychological pressure associated with the constant confrontation of danger, death, and public attention. Despite the harshness of life, gladiators were often more than mere slaves. Successful fighters could gain fame and recognition, sometimes even their freedom. The best of them became stars of the arena, whose names were known in the city and who were admired by the audience. Everyday life at the Ludus School prepared them to earn this recognition, but it was also a constant reminder that the life of a gladiator was fragile and precious, that every fight in the arena was a race between skill, luck, and the will to survive. The training and everyday life of the gladiators thus reveal a world in which discipline, physical performance, and mental strength were inextricably linked. They show that the gladiators were not only tools of entertainment, but people whose lives and fate were shaped by a complex system of power, ritual, and public expectation. Every move, punch, and parry reflected the harsh reality of their existence, a reality that incessantly prepared them for the moment when they stepped into the arena and faced death or glory. Chapter 7: Famous Gladiators and Their Stories. In the long history of gladiatorial games, there have been fighters whose names became known far beyond the arena. They were heroes, role models, or symbolic figures whose lives and deeds reflected the fascination of Roman society and later also of posterity. While most gladiators remained anonymous, some stood out for their exceptional skill, courage, or strategic skill and became legends of their time. One of the most famous gladiators was Spartacus, whose name is still associated with rebellion and freedom today. Spartacus was no ordinary gladiator. He was a former soldier who had fallen into slavery and was trained in a Ludus school. His military experience, tactical skills, and charismatic leadership made him an outstanding figure. Spartacus managed to lead an uprising against the Roman Empire that spread across Italy, mobilizing thousands of slaves and gladiators. Although the uprising was eventually crushed, Spartacus remains a symbol of the struggle against oppression and of the irrepressible will for freedom. Another well-known gladiator was Flama, a Syrian who became famous in the arenas of Rome for his endurance and fearlessness. Flama fought in the arena for over a decade, winning numerous duels and being given the opportunity to gain his freedom several times, but refused. His life shows how fame and loyalty to school or one's own gladiator caste could play an important role. Flama embodied the extreme dedication to the profession of gladiator and the willingness to risk everything for honor and recognition. Commodus, emperor and gladiator at the same time, is another fascinating example, even if his case was different. Commodus himself appeared in the arena, often under conditions that ensured his status as emperor, but his battles contributed to the creation of legends. He staged himself as a gladiator, which made him an object of admiration and criticism at the same time. The stories about Commodus show how the gladiatorial games not only shaped slaves and professional fighters, but also influenced the political and social life of Rome. In addition to these well-known figures, there were countless less famous gladiators whose courage and skill thrilled the spectators. Many of them became heroes of the cities in which they fought, receiving gifts, honors, and sometimes even lifelong privileges. The stories of these fighters have been recorded in chronicles, poems, and speeches, showing that gladiators were not only tools of entertainment, but also bearers of ideals such as bravery, loyalty, and endurance. The fascination for famous gladiators lay not only in their physical abilities, but also in the dramaturgy of their lives. Every victory, every defeat, and every special action in the arena told a story that the audience followed with excitement. A successful gladiator could use his fame to gain influence, improve his status, and even change the fate of his family. At the same time, the risk was omnipresent. A single misstep could mean death, and fame was often as transient as life itself. The stories of famous gladiators show how closely fame, courage, and fate were intertwined. They illustrate the extreme duality of life in the arena, where every heroic deed was accompanied with danger and every decision had life-changing consequences. Gladiators such as Spartacus, Flama, or Commodus were remembered not only because they fought, but also because they explored the limits of humanity through their deeds, inspiring the imagination of contemporaries and posterity alike. Chapter 8. Female Gladiators, Women in the Arena. While most gladiators were men, there is historical evidence that women also fought in Rome's arenas. These so-called gladiators, or gladiatrices, were rare, but their existence sheds a fascinating light on gender roles, social norms, and the flexibility of Roman entertainment culture. They usually performed in special spectacles that the audience found particularly appealing, as the combination of physical strength, courage, and rarity created additional tension. The female gladiators were trained in a similar way to their male colleagues, although there were probably differences in the intensity and duration of the training. They had to develop strength, technique, and endurance to meet the demands of the fights. They often competed against each other or against male gladiators in productions that were designed less for death than for spectacle. Their training probably took place in special schools or separate areas of the ludus schools, and as with the male gladiators, discipline was a basic requirement. Roman society was ambivalent about the gladiators. On the one hand, they were admired for their courage, skill, and ability to compete in the arena. On the other hand, their appearance was considered a provocation of social norms, since women in Roman culture were not usually considered fighters or public performers. The portrayal of women in the arena was therefore not only entertainment, but also a form of transgression that amazed the audience and sparked discussions about power, sexuality, and role models. The fights of the female gladiators were often more staged and dramaturgically directed than those of the men. They were advertised in a special way, their names and skills were immortalized in inscriptions or on coins, and their appearance was a highlight of certain events. Nevertheless, they were just as exposed to the risk of death as male gladiators. The rarity of the gladiators gave their performances an exclusive character, which increased the entertainment value for the audience and at the same time underlined the uniqueness of each encounter. Famous gladiators such as Amazon and Achillea are mentioned in contemporary sources, and there are depictions that show them in full armor and with typical weapons. These women demonstrated not only physical strength, but also strategic thinking and courage, qualities that were just as crucial in the arena as they were in their male counterparts. Their struggles symbolized resistance, assertiveness, and a form of emancipation within the strict hierarchies of Rome, even if this expression of freedom took place in a narrowly limited and controlled way. The existence of the gladiators shows that the Roman arena was a space in which social norms were tested and sometimes broken up. Women who fought as gladiators stood for an exception that blurred the boundaries between gender, power, and entertainment. They became symbolic figures for courage, entertainment value, and the complexity of Roman culture. And their life in the arena complements the image of gladiator culture with a perspective that combined courage, risk, and social tension. The gladiators were rare but unforgotten. Their appearance in the arena acted like a magnifying glass on the social structures of Rome, revealed the ambivalence of admiration and fascination, and enriched the history of the gladiators with an often overlooked facet. Their courage and presence reflect not only the toughness of the arena, but also the ability of people to cross borders, face challenges, and assert their own space in a system of violence and control.
Chapter 9. Politics and Society. The Power Behind the Games. The gladiatorial games were far more than mere entertainment. They were a reflection of Roman power, an instrument of social control, and a means of conveying political messages. In the streets of Rome, on the stands of the arenas, and in the inscriptions of the city, a system manifested itself in which violence, fame, and public spectacle value were skillfully combined. The games served not only to entertain the population, but also to ensure loyalty, demonstrate political authority, and channel social tensions. Emperors, senators, and wealthy patricians used the gladiatorial games to consolidate their power. They financed elaborate events, distributed tickets to the population, and ensured that certain gladiators, especially those who possessed fame or spectacular fighting skills, were put in the spotlight. Whoever controlled the games also controlled the attention of the people. The arena thus became a place where political messages were conveyed, often subtly, sometimes openly. A well-staged fight could demonstrate the strength of a ruler, underline his generosity, or symbolize the unity of society. The games also had a social function. They connected people from different classes in a common experience, distracted from social problems, and offered a form of collective catharsis. In the arena, aggression and conflict were acted out in a controlled way, while the spectators were emotionally involved. The dramatic fights, the courage of the gladiators, and the threat of death created an intense experience that both entertained the audience and taught them to recognize the limits of courage, loyalty, and social order. The political dimension of the games was also reflected in the fact that gladiators became tools for securing power. Certain fighters were deliberately promoted, while others were used as a warning or symbol of punishment. The staging of life and death served to demonstrate political stability and at the same time remind the audience of the hierarchies of the city. In this context, gladiators were not only fighters, but also means of propaganda, whose bodies and deeds conveyed a message that had an impact far beyond the arena. The games were also a reflection of Rome's social structure. Slaves, prisoners of war, and convicts made up the bulk of the gladiators, and their fight served as an allegory of power, submission, and control. At the same time, despite their low social status, outstanding gladiators were able to gain fame, influence, and sometimes even freedom. This paradox, the combination of submission and social recognition, illustrates how complex the role of gladiators was in Roman society. They were both symbols of the power of the rulers and figures of admiration for the people.
The political and social function of the gladiatorial games shows that they had an impact far beyond the arena. They were a means of channeling social tensions, securing loyalty, and demonstrating power. At the same time, they offered the audience an intense emotional experience that emphasized courage, skill, and the will to survive. Every battle, every duel, and every staging reflected the mechanisms of Rome rule, the balance between violence and control, between entertainment and politics. The gladiatorial games were thus not just a sport or spectacle, but a complex system that combined power, society, and human fascination.
Chapter 10. The Arenas of Rome. Architecture of the Spectacle. The gladiatorial games would not have become what they were without their imposing venues. The arenas of Rome, especially the famous Colosseum, were architectural masterpieces that were not only functional but also symbolic. They served to stage violence and entertainment in a spectacular way while demonstrating the power and wealth of the Roman Empire. The architecture of the arenas was designed to impress the spectators, make the gladiators visible, and maximize the dramatic impact of each battle. The most famous arena, the Colosseum, was built in the 1st century AD under the emperors Vespasian and Titus. It could accommodate tens of thousands of spectators and was a symbol of Roman engineering. The construction of stone, concrete, and travertine enabled a sophisticated system of rows of seats, entrances, and escape routes. Each tribune was designed to reflect the social rank of the spectators. Emperors and senators took the best seats while the population sat in the upper tiers. This arrangement reflected the hierarchy of the city and made the social order visible. The arena itself was designed in such a way that the fights were easy to follow from all angles. The floor was made of sand, which absorbed the blood and made the fights vivid for the audience. Under the arena, there were complex substructures, so-called hypogea, in which gladiators, animals, and technical devices were prepared for the staging. Ramps, elevators, and hidden doors allowed for surprise appearances, sudden attacks, or the introduction of wild animals. The entire architecture was therefore designed to create tension and make the spectacle dynamic. Not only the Colosseum, but also numerous smaller arenas in cities and provinces of the Roman Empire testify to the popularity of the games. These stadiums followed similar architectural principles, often adapted to regional conditions. They were expressions of Roman presence, power, and culture, even in far-flung provinces. The construction of such arenas showed that the gladiatorial games were a central element of public life, dominating not only the capital but permeating the entire empire. The arenas also had a symbolic function. They were not only places of violence but also of the staging of Roman values: courage, strength, skill, and the ability to face the challenges of life. Every wall, grandstand, and entrance to the arena was part of a carefully planned backdrop that added to the drama of the games. For the spectators, these buildings were a place of fascination where entertainment, social order, and political message were combined. The architecture of the arenas shows how closely space, function, and symbolism were connected. The buildings were not only scenes of death and glory, but also instruments of power that made the gladiatorial games an unforgettable experience. The combination of engineering, dramaturgical design, and social hierarchy reflected the complexity of Roman society. And the gladiators appeared in a framework that made their deeds seem even more significant, dangerous, and fascinating. Chapter 11. Weapons and Fighting Techniques. The Art of Gladiators' Craft. The fascination of gladiatorial games was based not only on courage and strength, but also on the mastery of weapons and fighting techniques. Each gladiator was intensively trained to survive in the arena, developing a fighting style that was often adapted to their training, physique, and chosen weapon class. The variety of weapons, armor, and tactics made the games a spectacle full of dynamics, strategy, and dramatic twists.
Among the most famous weapons were the gladius, the short sword, and the spatha, a longer sword used primarily by cavalry or heavily armored gladiators. The gladius was compact, capable of cutting and stabbing, ideal for fast, precise movements in tight combat situations. The gladiators used it to perform lightning-fast attacks, surprise the opponent, and detect defensive windows. The art was not only in the strength, but in the technique. Evasive movements, attacks from unusual angles, and clever use of the arena were decisive. Shields were another central element of the equipment. The scutum, a large rectangular shield, offered protection and could be used offensively at the same time to push back enemies or throw them off balance. Other gladiators preferred smaller, rounded shields that allowed more freedom of movement and supported fast, agile attacks. The choice of weapon and shield determined the battle strategy and influenced the type of encounters, making each arena a place of individual tactics. Not all gladiators fought with sword and shield. Some specialized classes used spears, tridents, nets, or even exotic weapons, which expanded the range of combat techniques. The retiarius, a gladiator with a net and trident, embodied agility and strategy, while heavily armored types like the murmillo relied on brute strength, endurance, and protection. The battles thus became a game of speed, skill, courage, and cleverness in which every weapon, every movement, and every attack had a meaning. The techniques themselves have been trained over years. Gladiators went through strict schools where they learned not only how to handle weapons, but also the correct posture, evasive maneuvers, and tactical thinking. They learned how to read opponents, identify weaknesses, and influence the course of a fight in their favor. Precision, timing, and mental strength were as important as physical fitness, and the best gladiators were characterized by a combination of intelligence, experience, and instinct. In addition, there were choreographic elements. Fights were not only physical confrontations, but often staged events that increased tension and drama. A gladiator could fake an attack, exaggerate a defense, or use a surprise counterattack to impress the crowd. Every weapon, step, and punch was part of a game that blurred the lines between martial arts and acting. The weapons and fighting techniques of the gladiators show that these fighters stood out not only for courage, but also for skill, training, and strategic thinking. The arena was a place where physical strength met tactical skill, and every weapon, style, and move offered the opportunity to experience glory, honor, or death. This interplay of technique, tactics, and courage creates the timeless fascination of the gladiators, which goes far beyond pure combat.
Chapter 12. Animal Fights and Exotic Shows, the Venetaines. In addition to gladiatorial fights, animal fights, known as venetaines, formed a central part of the Roman games. These events not only showcased the brute force of gladiators, but also showcased the exotic world beyond Rome, the power of the empire over distant lands, and the ability of humans to control animals. Lions, tigers, elephants, bears, and crocodiles were brought into the arena to stage fights against gladiators or among themselves, creating a mixture of fascination, horror, and amazement in the audience. The organization of such shows was time-consuming. Animals had to be brought from distant provinces, transported, fed, and housed in cages. For the gladiators, this meant additional preparation, as dealing with wild animals required completely different skills than fighting human opponents. Courage, responsiveness, and strategic thinking were crucial to surviving the animals' attacks. Often, special gladiators, so-called bestiarii, were trained to fight these dangerous opponents. The animal fights also had a political dimension. They symbolized the power of the Roman state over nature and culture, over distant countries and their creatures. By displaying and controlling exotic animals in the arena, Rome demonstrated its global reach and its ability to control even nature's most dangerous elements. The audience thus received not only entertainment, but also a visual message of dominance, control, and imperial superiority. The staging of the venetaines was often dramatic.
Animals were released into the arena while gladiators, armed and trained, tried to subdue them. Sometimes, fights between different animal species have been arranged to provide a particularly spectacular spectacle. The dramatic tension, the danger, and the unpredictable twists and turns made these shows a highlight of the games. At the same time, they offered spectators a way to experience the strength of the gladiators in a completely different context, one that tested instinct, courage, and tactical skill. But the exotic shows were not only for entertainment. They also had a moral and pedagogical function. Courage, bravery, and strategic thinking were rewarded, while weakness and imprudence were punished. The arena thus became a teaching space where spectators experienced lessons about human skills, survival, and control over nature. The spectacular animal fights combined tension, danger, and an impressive display of Roman power, making them an unforgettable part of public life. The Venetanes expanded the image of gladiatorial games and showed that the Roman arena was far more than a place of human struggle. They combined exoticism, danger, and theater into an experience that demonstrated both the skills of the gladiators and the reach and control of Rome. In this interplay of man and animal, of courage and staging, the complexity of the Roman entertainment world is revealed, in which the arena served as a stage for the greatest dramas of antiquity. Chapter 13. Education in the Ludus Schools, School of Survival. The fascination of the gladiators was not based solely on courage or physical strength, but on years of rigorous training. This took place in special schools, the so-called ludi, which were spread throughout the Roman Empire. Here, men, and occasionally women, were prepared for life in the arena. The ludus schools were not ordinary training facilities, but highly organized institutions in which discipline, technique, and psychological strength were equally promoted. The daily routine in a ludus school began early in the morning and was characterized by physical hardship. Gladiators trained for several hours a day, practiced sword fighting, the use of spears, shields, or nets, and perfected their movements. The training was systematic and purposeful. Endurance, strength, agility, and precision were equally promoted to prepare the fighters for every possible situation in the arena. Tactical thinking also played a central role, as every encounter in the arena required planning and responsiveness. In addition to physical training, the focus was on discipline. Gladiators lived under strict rules that determined behavior, nutrition, and social order within the school. Respect for the teachers, the coaching staff, and the classmates was essential. Any violation of the rules could result in harsh penalties, as discipline was considered crucial for survival in the arena. The ludus schools were thus not only training facilities, but also schools of self-control, obedience, and psychological preparation for extreme situations. The training also included tactical training. Gladiators learned to analyze opponents, recognize weaknesses, and use their own strengths in a targeted manner. Exercises in simulated fights, sparring-like duels, and choreographed scenarios helped to sharpen instincts and train quick decisions. Mental strength was just as important as physical fitness because the ability to control fear, endure pain, and make rational decisions in the heat of the moment could be the difference between life and death. The ludus schools were also places of social structure. Gladiators lived together, ate together, and were formed into communities that fostered hierarchy, loyalty, and team spirit. Although they were often slaves or prisoners of war, a strong sense of community developed within the school, which increased cohesion and motivation. Successes, injuries, and victories were shared, and the bonds between gladiators could inspire lifelong loyalty and friendship, even in a world where death was omnipresent. Finally, the care of the body also played a central role. Nutrition, massage, healing methods, and medical care were part of the training to prevent injuries and maintain performance. Gladiators were given special diets to build muscle, store energy, and withstand the stresses of the arena. The combination of rigorous training, psychological preparation, and physical care made them highly specialized fighters whose skills went far beyond mere brute force. The ludus schools were thus the heart of gladiator culture. They formed men and women into fighters ready to face the deadly challenges of the arena, while creating a structure that combined discipline, technique, and mental strength. The training in the ludi shows that behind the spectacle of the games, there was a complex system of preparation, strategy, and self-control that made the gladiators the most formidable figures of Roman antiquity.
Chapter 14. Rituals and Ceremonies, the Sacred of the Arena. The gladiatorial games were not only physical fights, but also deeply rooted in ritual and religious traditions. Every fight, every entry into the arena, and every staging followed certain ceremonies that placed the games in a cultural, social, and religious context. The gladiators, the organizers, and the spectators were part of a complex system of symbolism, faith, and ritual that combined death, courage, and honor. Before each fight, the ceremonies often began with a ceremonial entry of the gladiators into the arena. They wore their armor, weapons, and insignia, accompanied by music, drums, and sometimes pageants. This procession served several purposes. It prepared the audience for the spectacle, honored the gladiators as fighters, and symbolically represented the beginning of a ritual event. In these moments, the fight was understood not only as a sporting confrontation, but as a cultic act that pointed beyond the purely human. Religious aspects also permeated the games. Before the battles, sacrifices were often made, prayers were said, or gods were invoked. Mars, the god of war, and Hercules, who was considered the patron saint of gladiators, were the focus of many ceremonies. These rituals were intended to ensure courage, protection, and victory, but also to symbolize participation in a divinely sanctioned event. Death and danger were thus given a ritual dimension that underlined the seriousness of the battles and the importance of the arena in public life. The spectators themselves were involved in this ritual setting. The games were public events where emotions, jubilation, and collective tension were part of the ritual. The audience witnessed not only physical confrontations, but also a staging of power, honor, and divine order. In a way, the arena functioned as a stage on which social hierarchies, tests of courage, and the relationship between man and fate became visible and tangible. Even after the fights, there were ceremonies that marked the outcome of the fight. They ranged from honoring victorious gladiators to symbolic gestures of gratitude to the gods to burying fallen fighters. A victorious gladiator could receive public recognition, places of honor in the stands, or material rewards, while the death of a fighter was ritualized to show both respect and the inevitability of fate. These post-rituals underlined that the games were not just entertainment, but an orderly, culturally anchored event that combined life, death, and honor. The ritual dimension of the gladiatorial games makes it clear that they went far beyond sporting or violent confrontations. Every action in the arena, every ceremony, and every sacrifice combined the human with the sacred and created an overall cultural experience. Courage, skill, and sacrifice were presented in a framework that elevated struggle to a symbolic act in which power, religion, and society were inextricably intertwined. The rituals and ceremonies of the gladiators showed that the arena was not only a place of death and entertainment, but also a reflection of Roman values, beliefs, and social order. They turned brutal battles into meaningful plots that involved both spectators and fighters in a complex web of culture, religion, and politics. Hidden in this sacred element was part of the timeless fascination of gladiatorial games. The mixture of danger, courage, staging, and divine symbolism that made the arena a unique place of antiquity. Chapter 15. Famous Gladiators, Legends of the Arena. Among the countless fighters who ever entered the Roman arenas, there were some whose fame extended far beyond their lifetimes.
These gladiators became legends because they attracted the attention of the public and the rulers through extraordinary skill, courage, charisma, or spectacular deeds. Their stories combine reality and myth and show how individuals shaped the collective memory of Roman society. An example of gladiator fame is Spartacus, who became famous not only for his fighting power, but above all for his leadership role in a historic uprising. As a slave from Thrace, he began his career in a ludus school before fleeing with other gladiators in 73 BC and leading an uprising against Rome. Spartacus became a symbol of resistance and freedom, and although his end was tragic, his name remained unforgotten. Legend shows how gladiators could become not only fighters, but also political figures whose actions had far-reaching consequences. Other gladiators gained fame solely through their skills in the arena. Flamma, a famous Samnite gladiator, stood out for his numerous victories that made him a crowd favorite. His fighting technique, endurance, and tactical skills led to him being given the chance for freedom several times, but refusing it in order to continue to achieve fame in the arena. Such figures make it clear that the gladiator was not only a tool of the spectacle, but could also decide on honor, career, and identity himself, albeit within a narrowly limited framework. The fame of a gladiator depended heavily on the interaction with the audience. Fighters who delivered spectacular duels, defeated dangerous opponents, or staged dramatized scenes were celebrated, respected, and sometimes downright revered. This popularity could bring material advantages, money, gifts, privileges, or even their own house. At the same time, the gladiator became a symbol of courage, endurance, and virtuosity, qualities that were highly valued in Roman society. Legends also arose from the stories of writers, historians, and the people. Famous fighters were idealized in stories, their victories dramatized, and their courage heroized. Myth and reality merged, so that gladiators appeared like heroes, whose deeds were significant not only for the moment in the arena, but also for the collective memory of Rome. The arena thus became not only a place of physical testing, but also a stage for the construction of legends. Famous gladiators show that the fascination of the arena went far beyond pure combat. They were masters of their art, actors in public play, and symbols of values such as courage, perseverance, and honor. Their stories combine the real harshness of life in the arena with the mythical splendor of fame that still shapes the idea of gladiator centuries later. It makes it visible that the arena was not only a place of death, but also of memory, identity, and the creation of legends. Chapter 16. Women in the Arena, the Rare Gladiators. Although gladiator fights were primarily the domain of male fighters, there were also women who held their own in the arenas of Rome. These rare female gladiators, often referred to as gladiatrices, fascinate historians and archaeologists because they spectacularly cross the boundaries of Roman gender roles. Their existence proves that the arena was a place of extreme exceptional situations where social norms, power, and entertainment collided with each other. Women in the arena were often staged as an exotic attraction. They fought against other women, sometimes also against male gladiators or wild animals, whereby the staging was often more in the foreground than the fighting technique. Their performance was spectacular and unusual, and the audience reacted with the same mixture of amazement, enthusiasm, and sensationalism as with the male gladiators. The gladiatrices wore armor, weapons, and insignia, often designed specifically for them, and had to show similar discipline and courage as their male counterparts. The sources on female gladiators are sparse, but references can be found in literary texts, inscriptions, and archaeological finds. Some depictions show women with helmets, shields, and swords, while other scenes of female fighters are captured in historical reliefs and funerary steles. These representations emphasize not only their physical presence, but also the theatrical dimension of the fights. The gladiatrices embodied a mixture of danger, allure, and surprise that captivated the audience. The social position of the gladiators was ambivalent. Many were slaves or prisoners of war whose appearance in the arena was a form of coercion, but at the same time, the arena offered an opportunity for attention, recognition, and sometimes even material benefits. A few were able to gain fame and influence through success and popularity, similar to the male gladiators. Nevertheless, the participation of women in the games remained the exception and was often staged as a sensation or extraordinary event. The existence of the gladiatrices shows that the Roman arena was a place of extremes, where social norms were questioned, broken, and at the same time staged. The women in the arena expanded the image of gladiator culture by uniquely embodying the dimension of courage, risk, and public performance. They were at the same time fighters, actresses, and symbols of a Roman world in which entertainment, power, and social order were intertwined in a complex way. Although the gladiators rarely performed, they left a lasting impression. Their stories, depictions, and inscriptions are a reminder that the arena was a space of possibilities, even for those whose presence was considered extraordinary or controversial. In their rarity, courage, and staging, the gladiatrices embody a special aspect of the Roman entertainment world that still enriches the idea of the complexity of gladiatorial games today.
Chapter 17. Medical Care, the Art of Healing Between Life and Death. The arena was a place of danger where any fight could end fatally. But as brutal as the spectacle was, the Romans attached great importance to the medical care of the gladiators. Injuries had to be treated quickly to ensure the survival of the fighters and allow them to return to the arena. The ludus schools and the arenas therefore had specialized doctors who worked closely with the trainers and supervisors to create a kind of early medical system. Medical care began in schools. Gladiators received regular checkups to monitor their fitness and detect injuries early. Bruises, sprains, or cuts were treated, and prophylactic measures were taken to prevent infections. Nutrition and rest periods were also part of medical care. A balanced diet, often rich in proteins and carbohydrates, helped to build muscles, store energy, and promote regeneration. For more serious injuries, the actual surgical and therapeutic art was used. Doctors used instruments such as scalpels, forceps, and staples to treat wounds, stabilize bone fractures, or stop bleeding. Plasters, ointments made from herbs, beeswax, and minerals, as well as therapeutic baths were used to support healing processes. The Roman physicians were surprisingly progressive. They knew about the importance of cleanliness, immobilization, and systematic wound care, even if the understanding of infections was still rudimentary. Medical care was not only practical but also strategic. Gladiators were valuable investments. Every lost fighter meant not only a human loss but also economic damage. Successful fighters could bring in considerable sums. So it was in the interest of the ludus schools and the organizers to maintain them and provide them with the best possible care. Doctors thus played a key role in the survival of the gladiators and in the continuation of the games. The medical care even extended beyond the physical treatment. Gladiators had to remain mentally resilient, and psychological stability was fostered by coaches and doctors paying attention to fear, stress, and trauma. Rituals, training strategies, and social structure within the schools helped to maintain the balance of the fighters so that they remained both physically and mentally operational. The existence of a specialized medical practice within gladiatorial culture shows how far the Romans were willing to use scientific and practical means to ensure the survival and performance of their fighters. The combination of physical care, surgical treatment, nutrition, and psychological care made the gladiators highly specialized athletes whose survival and success in the arena required far more than pure luck or brute force. Thus, it becomes clear that behind a bloody spectacle of the arena was a complex system of medical care that saved lives, maximized performance, and ensured the continuity of the gladiatorial games.
The healing art of the gladiators was thus an indispensable part of the Roman entertainment apparatus, which often decided the boundary between death and survival.
Chapter 18. Psychological stress, courage, fear, and mental preparation. The gladiators lived in a world where death and violence were omnipresent. Every fight in the arena meant a risk that often made the difference between life and death. But while strength, technique, and endurance could be visibly trained, the mental strain of the fighters was invisible and yet decisive. Dealing with fear, stress, and constantly confronting one's own mortality was a central part of their lives, and Roman gladiator culture had developed strategies to promote mental resilience. The preparation for the arena began not only physically but also psychologically. Gladiators had to learn to control fear and avoid panic. Mental exercises, training battles, and repeated confrontation with dangerous situations helped to sharpen reflexes and develop emotional stability. The ability to stay calm in dicey moments and make rational decisions was often more important than pure muscle power. Anyone who lost control in the heat of the moment immediately risked death. Another psychological factor was the publicity of the fighting. Thousands of spectators cheering, screaming, or booing created enormous social pressure. Gladiators had to learn to channel this attention, use it as motivation, or block out the tension. Mental strength meant not being intimidated by the crowd and focusing on the fight itself. Psychological training that required discipline, confidence, and focus. The hierarchy within the Ludus schools also contributed to psychological preparation. Respect for coaches, comrades, and higher-ranking people created a structure that offered security and orientation. At the same time, it promoted competitiveness, ambition, and the desire for recognition. The social pressure was thus doubly effective. It formed character and fighting spirit, but also increased the mental load, as mistakes or weaknesses had consequences. Last but not least, the confrontation with mortality played a central role. Any fight could end fatally, and many gladiators had seen friends and comrades in arms die. This constant proximity to death required a special psychological resilience. The ability to accept risk, develop courage, and focus on the moment without being paralyzed by fear. Rituals, mental preparation, and a strong sense of community helped to cope with these stresses and stabilize the fighters. The psychological dimension shows that gladiators were not only physical athletes, but also mental warriors. Their success depended on combining physical strength, tactical skill, and mental resilience. Anxiety control, concentration, and the ability to manage pressure were crucial factors in survival and fame. The arena was thus a touchstone of the psyche, a place where courage, self-control, and mental strength were often just as important as swordsmanship and muscle power. The mental preparation of the gladiators makes it clear that the gladiator culture was a highly complex mixture of body, mind, and social staging. Surviving in the arena required not only technique, strength, and strategy, but also a deep understanding of one's own psyche, fear, and courage. Anyone who mastered this balance could become a legend. Those who failed paid the highest price, death. Chapter 19. Economic and Political Aspects, Power, Money, and Propaganda. The gladiatorial games were much more than mere entertainment. They were a central element of Roman society, deeply integrated into economic, social, and political structures. The arena was a place where power was staged, loyalty was generated, and economic interests were pursued. The organization of the games required immense resources, and the way gladiators were used reflected political strategies and economic calculations. Politically, the games served as a demonstration of power. Rulers, senators, or wealthy citizens who acted as sponsors used the arena to increase their popularity and legitimize their power. Through generous events, spectacular fights, and generous rewards for viewers, they were able to gain sympathy, calm social tensions, and foster loyalty. The games were an instrument of propaganda. They showed the strength of the state, the order of society, and the ability of the elite to provide entertainment and security.
Economically, the gladiatorial games were a huge apparatus. Ludus schools, weapons manufacturers, armaments manufacturers, animal dealers, doctors, and trainers benefited from the existence of the arena. Every gladiator was an investment. His training, equipment, care, and medical care cost money, while his fights generated revenue, prestige, and public attention. The trade in gladiators, whether through purchase, sale, or training, was a lucrative business that extended far beyond the arena. The games also influenced other sectors of the economy. Construction projects for arenas, accommodation for gladiators, logistical organization of animal transports, and food supply were large economic undertakings that employed numerous people. Markets, craftsmen, and merchants benefited from the demand for goods and services related to the games. In this respect, gladiator fights were an engine of economic activity, generating revenue for private and public actors. At the same time, the games had social functions. They could channel conflicts, entertain the people, and convey political messages. Through the staging of struggles, victories, and defeats, hierarchies, power relations, and social norms were made visible. The arena was a mirror of Roman society, in which violence, courage, loyalty, and honor were demonstrated and lived at the same time. The combination of economic gain, political demonstration of power, and social control makes it clear that the gladiatorial games were a complex system. They combined human extremes, death, courage, combat, and entertainment with strategic interests that resonated far beyond the arena. Whoever controlled the gladiators controlled an instrument of power that served economic, political, and social dimensions at the same time. The economic and political aspects of the gladiatorial games show that the arena was more than a place of violence. It was a multifunctional instrument that combined entertainment, demonstration of power, and economic calculation. The games were thus a central element of Roman culture that touched all levels of society and made the arena a place where power, money, and symbolic staging worked together in a unique way.
Chapter 20. The Legacy of the Gladiators, From the Arena to Modern Culture. The gladiators of Rome have long since disappeared. Their arenas are falling into disrepair, but their legacy lives on. They have become symbols of courage, the will to survive, physical and mental strength, and the fascinating mixture of danger and entertainment. In modern culture, gladiators appear in literature, film, theater, and video games, often idealized and mythologized, but always as a mirror of human fascination with heroism, struggle, and sacrifice. Their stories have survived the centuries because they touch on universal themes: the confrontation with fear and death, the pursuit of fame, the tension between individual freedom and social control. Films and novels about gladiators take up these elements and stage them anew, often in connection with political power, social injustice, and the tension between personal courage and public staging. These narratives show that the fascination of gladiators lies not only in the physical violence, but in the psychological, social, and symbolic dimension of their existence. Modern sports culture, especially martial arts, wrestling, or mixed martial arts, also carries on elements of gladiator culture. The stage, the audience, the drama of the fight, the staging of victories and defeats are reminiscent of the Roman arenas in many ways. While today's fighters are not slaves and do not necessarily risk their lives, the structure of training, ritual, competition, and glory takes up classic elements that have shaped gladiators for centuries. The historical study of gladiators has also helped to draw a differentiated picture of Roman society. The arena was a place of extremes, where power, money, entertainment, courage, and death met. It shows how cultural practices shape people, test boundaries, and reflect on social norms. The life of the gladiators opens up insights into aspects of control, resistance, self-assertion, and the importance of public staging, topics that are still relevant today. After all, gladiators are symbols of extreme human situations.
Their stories warn that courage and survival are often ensured by preparation, technique, and mental strength, a universal lesson that holds true for thousands of years. The fascination with gladiators shows that people admire both the physical drama and the symbolic dimension of combat and risk. As archetypes, they stand for the tension between life and death, order and chaos, courage and fear, which shape human existence in all its facets. In this way, the legacy of the gladiators comes alive not only in museums or archaeological sites, but also in the collective imagination. Their stories combine past and present, history and myth, reality and staging. They remind us that the arena was much more than a place of death. It was a place of remembrance, of legend-making, and of reflection on the limits of human courage and social control. Gladiators thus remain immortal symbols of a culture that impressively staged the courage and extremes of being human.